Okay, recording started.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our CalGreen webinar today. And the presentation is going to start soon. It's going to be recorded. All of you will be muted, and put your questions into the Q&A box that you see down there, and we'll address them later or maybe throughout. And if you're attending live today, you can take advantage of the ICC TEUs that are available. I'm going to put my email in the chat box so you can contact me and I'll send you that information. So next slide. Colleen?
Yeah, do you not see that it moved forward?
Ah, there it went. Okay, yeah. So this webinar is part of the sustainability series, and you can access this and the other webinars that we've had through the City of Chula Vista Clean website. And don't miss our next one on December 8th, when we're going to talk about indoor air quality and ventilation. Next slide. So today we have two wonderful presenters, Colleen Fitzsimmons and Douglas Cott. So Colleen, you can take it away.
Thanks, Lynn. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our presentation on the 2019 CalGreen Non-Residential Building Code. Yay! So we've got a few topics we're going to cover today. We'll review CalGreen history and the California Building Code, CalGreen's mandatory non-residential measures, CalGreen's voluntary non-residential measures, which provide a leadership standard inside of the code. They're an opportunity to go above minimum requirements and often become the basis for advanced local ordinances. The voluntary measures are referred to as Tier 1 and 2, with Tier 2 indicating the most advanced option. You'll also see two icons here and throughout the presentation. The three-level triangle icon indicates where mandatory measures have a Tier 1 or Tier 2 voluntary measure associated with them, and where the Chula Vista's green building ordinances are in alignment with CalGreen, you'll see the Chula Vista logo. So I'm going to be talking about the bottom half of this slide. CalGreen history officially started in 2004 when an executive order created the Green Building Action Team. We created our first green building code in 2008, spurred on by California's landmark initiative, AB 32, which established a goal of reducing greenhouse gases to 1990 levels by 2020. The 2008 code was voluntary, but created a pathway for the mandatory code that followed in 2010. Every 3 years, we go through an update process where changes are proposed and go through public review, and after adoption, become effective January 1st of the following year. In between the triennial code adoption, we publish amendments and errata, and begin our process to formalize the intervening code supplement at the 1.5-year mark, which we have just completed for this code cycle and which should go into effect July 1st, 2021. And subsequently, each code cycle has gotten us further along the way to ensure we can meet our greenhouse gas reduction goal. So there are 12 parts defined for the California Building Standards Code, which is Title 24. Today, we'll be looking at Part 11, the California Green Building Standards Code, otherwise known as CalGreen. CalGreen interacts with the 10 other parts, and they are meant to work together. You'll see that within CalGreen itself, where there are references to the plumbing code, the energy code, and other parts of the building code.
Yeah, if I could add one comment on the energy code. Colleen is right that the Building Standards Commission creates the total suite of codes that make up the Title 24 set here. But sometimes we refer to Title 24 and we only mean the energy code, which is really just part 6 of the list you see there. And actually the part 6 piece is actually developed by the California Energy Commission. They do it in partnership with the Building Standards Commission as a part of that triennial or every 3-year update, but they do work together. And you're going to hear today as we go through specific parts of CalGreen that reference the energy code and somewhat vice versa as well. Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you. So CalGreen is not a standalone code. It's enforced like other California codes, coordinated with other state and local municipal codes, maintains the current relationship between enforcing agencies and builders, and establishes uniformity and consistency. Every code cycle, Chula Vista has adopted CalGreen for its green building standard, and historically Chula Vista has gone beyond CalGreen to include additional requirements. One additional measure that Chula Vista has adopted since 2013 is the Consultant Services Ordinance, stating that a consultant may be needed to evaluate your project and provide recommendations. Developers often do this to create commitment and assurance and ensure an easier review process. So today we'll be covering these 6 sections, chapters 1 through 3, chapter 5, which is the mandatory non-residential measures, chapter 8, compliance forms, and the appendix for non-residential voluntary measures. So first off, chapter 1, administration. Our building codes are created and enforced with the purpose of improving public health, safety, and general welfare. And this holds just as true with CalGreen. This chapter also confirms all CalGreen requirements must be reflected in the construction documents, and documentation is required. We will see some compliance forms and checklists at the end of this presentation that can be used to ease the review process. The purpose of CalGreen goes beyond health and safety to reinforce sustainable building practices and breaks them down into these 5 areas. We'll see this in more detail when we get to chapter 5. Chapter 2 lists definitions, and every code cycle they add terms to reflect the advancements in green building technologies. This helps us define these technologies so we have common language around green building. This also creates a clear path around enforceability, consistency in application, and coordination with other codes. Vagueness creates risk and makes everyone's job difficult. So the reason we have this chapter is for consistency, clarity, and certainty. Chapter 3, green building, clarifies different project types and how this code gets applied to each, whether it's commercial, schools, alterations and additions, or tenant improvement projects. However, the local planning authority will make any final interpretation if there's any question of how the code will be applied. So let's hop into chapter 5, non-residential mandatory measures. As I mentioned earlier, this chapter is separated into 5 parts, which we'll go through shortly. And as we go through each section, you'll see a dark blue bar at the bottom of the screen. This is where we have included the code requirements for each section. We don't expect you to be able to read them during this presentation. However, we include them so that you can go back through the recording later and review them if you'd like. In section 5.1, planning and design, we look at environmentally responsible site selection, building design, building siting, and development. We do this to protect, restore, and enhance the environmental quality of the site and respect the integrity of adjacent properties through careful planning to minimize negative effects. Stormwater drainage and retention proactively addresses flooding of our buildings and the potential pollution of our oceans and waterways. First, we'll look at runoff concerns during construction. Designing and planning for proper stormwater drainage and retention can be done using the following: retention basins, filtering barriers or straw rolls, sedimentation control, or silt vents. None of which was used in this picture you see here on the slide, so you can see how debris and other runoff is going down into the stormwater system. Next slide. There we go. To help promote a healthy lifestyle and to meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, CalGreen promotes the use of bicycles by requiring secure parking for both visitors and employees. Generally, the number of required bicycle parking spots needs to equal 5% of the planned parking spaces, with some minimums. You can see them in the details below when you go back later. To promote the use of zero or low emitting vehicles, there are requirements for parking spaces set aside for those vehicles' use only. You'll see the tiered triangle icon here that lets us know that there are voluntary measures that go beyond these requirements. CalGreen also has requirements for charging infrastructure. That means raceways and properly sized electrical panels. And again, all of this has to be properly indicated in the construction documents. The reason we're pushing to get infrastructure included is that transportation is responsible for 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can make it easier for people to transition to clean air vehicles, it helps get us to our goals. It also helps prevent air pollution caused by fossil fuels, which impacts our health. Doug, did you want to tell us more about what some other communities are doing?
Yeah, this is a very popular area for projects or for communities to be looking at REACH codes. So REACH codes are locally adopted codes that go above and beyond the statewide minimums. And a lot of this is happening in Northern California right now around advancing electric vehicle charging infrastructure, going kind of beyond the percentage of spaces that are recommended, but getting into actually increasing the number of place charging. They're doing that to meet the local demand for electric vehicles. So there's a very popular REACH code measure. It really does often, what we're finding is that the statewide codes are far behind the consumer adoption of electric vehicles. And so local municipalities are really trying to encourage the investment in infrastructure for projects to avoid future costs of doing retrofits. So it's really a means of kind of reducing the overall cost of ownership for electric vehicles for building owners, but also for the vehicle owners as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So on this slide, we've got a table that shows the requirement for EV charging spaces. And there's a 10 parking space threshold before the requirement is triggered, moving up to 6% of the total if it's over 200. Light pollution is addressed in CalGreen as well, with limits on the amount of light that can escape an outdoor lighting fixture. We want to maximize the light in the intended area, the downlight, shown in this diagram in dark purple, while minimizing the light that escapes in 3 other directions. Behind the fixture in the orange areas in the diagram called backlight, upward, shown in the light blue on this diagram called uplight, or directly into people's eyes in the light purple zones called glare. There's a standardized rating for backlight, uplight, and glare that describes the amount of light that is emitted in those directions. We refer to them by the acronym of BUG ratings, and CalGreen sets limits as to what is allowed. Proper site design prevents flooding and stormwater runoff using natural features such as a water retention garden or vegetable bioswale, similar to what is pictured on the left. Other stormwater management methods, such as French drains, are also encouraged. These methods slow water runoff, giving the water a chance to infiltrate the soil and recharge groundwater sources. To reduce the heat island effect, shade trees are required for schools. The heat island effect describes the process where hardscapes heat up due to the sun and then reflect the heat back out, causing temperatures to rise in those areas. This causes an increased need for cooling, among other health and comfort issues. So to save money, we try to mitigate the heat island effect by shading hardscapes and allowing trees to absorb the solar radiation. Excuse me. In 2012, Chula Vista instituted a shade tree policy, but now CalGreen has caught up, so it's no longer in effect. Next is energy efficiency. Section 5.2 points directly at the Energy Code, Title 24, Part 6, to define the energy efficiency requirements. So Doug will tell us more about this.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. Yeah, as we mentioned previously, the interaction between the Energy Code and CalGreen is pretty significant. Most of the folks who have done green building projects are aware of the energy efficiency requirements, but not all folks who are responsible for inspecting and approving buildings at a city level are familiar with all of the green building pieces or the details of the Energy Code. But within the Energy Code, CalGreen, by its reference, requires all of the mandatory provisions of the California Energy Code. And then with that, there's also some performance criteria that show up in the tiers. Go to the next slide. Currently, the mandatory measures in the Energy Code address things like window performance and rating. So that was a big change from 2016 to 2019 about how we identify the energy performance of glazed elements of a building for non-res specifically. There's also minimum requirements for ventilation, filtration, and also the quantity of ventilation for certain use types. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that under the Cal Green section, because that's a direct interaction both between the energy code, which sets the minimums, and also then the Cal Green, which establishes a different approach to the same kind of metric of ventilation air. Related to the ventilation air is indoor air quality, indoor lighting controls, and outdoor lighting controls and equipment are also things that were kind of new mandatory measures in the 2019 code. The next slide, kind of highlighting some of the the other changes that happened in 2019. There's actually quite a lot there, but the biggest three areas, kind of what we just mentioned: healthcare facilities, which were formerly managed by OSHPD, now do fall under California Energy Code. And so, again, by reference, hospitals now do have a component of needing to comply with Cal Green as a result as well, because it's now incorporated into the building, the California Energy Code. The lighting, as I mentioned, indoor, outdoor lighting and controls. I think the simplest way to summarize that is basically the lighting power allowances are now based on LED lighting technology. So that's kind of a new thing for 2019. We had, in 2016 version of the code, had allowed for non-LED lighting essentially in the allowance, but basically all of our buildings now are the baseline energy use, the mandatory energy use is aligning to LED technology. And then the healthy indoor air quality and some filtration pieces, both Colleen will describe later about during construction, but also during occupancy, a minimum level of ventilation filtration. The next slide, I want to talk about a unique metric. When last time we talked about the residential codes, we were talking about the energy design rating, or the EDR score, which was tied to a HERS reference. But in commercial buildings or non-residential buildings, we use something called time-dependent valuation. Now, this was put in place many cycles ago, actually in the 2006 cycle, I believe, for the first time. And it's basically looked at the societal cost of energy at different times of the day and year, primarily applied to electric energy consumption. And there is also a seasonal TDV value for gas, so it gets a little bit higher in the winter as a multiplier, but primarily the bigger jumps happen for electricity. Now, the interesting thing to note here is this does not exactly align to our time of use rates. So a consumer doesn't get a signal about a TDV value. This is really just used to determine code compliance. And TDV is not something that can be measured. It's really something that can only be modeled using California approved software. So when we're doing non-residential buildings, energy modeling to show compliance, even to support the basics of Cal Green, when energy is used does matter. And you can see this sort of illustration of the shift of what will be happening is you can see for 2022 cycle, which is underway now, we're going to see an even lessening impact of energy use through the middle hours of the day when solar is abundant and cheap. And so right now we have that early evening peak for TDV energy use, and it does taper off kind of in the rest of the day. And just again to summarize, the TDV calculations do take into effect the source energy use, the transmission losses, and then the time of day. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Colleen to talk more about water efficiency and conservation.
Thanks, Doug. That was great. So now we're on to section 5.3. In a drought-prone region such as San Diego, where we import approximately 80% of our water, the environmental impact is intense, not only in loss of water during transport, but the energy required to get it here. This chapter covers conserving water used indoors, outdoors, and in wastewater conveyance. We can't fix what we can't track. So Cal Green requires submeters for spaces expected to use more than 1,000 gallons per day, or projects with more than 50,000 square feet. Metering gives us a bit more granularity to help determine if there's a problem, such as a leak or other unusual usage. Submetering also allows building managers to determine how much water each tenant is using and can incentivize the building occupants to use less water. Code requirements for fixtures and fittings haven't changed much in the last code cycle. Toilets must use a maximum of 1.28 gallons per flush. Bathroom faucets have a maximum flow rate of 0.5 gallons per minute, and metering faucets have a maximum of 0.2 gallons per cycle. This can have significant savings on water bills due to our high water rates in San Diego County. CalGreen also includes requirements for kitchen food waste disposers, limiting them to 1 gallon per minute, and must include an automatic shutoff. These are for commercial kitchens, by the way. So now let's look at outdoor water use. We're here in San Diego County. 23% of the county's outdoor water use is at our non-residential buildings. For the most part, we are using expensive potable drinking water for this. Section 5.304 is another example of CalGreen coordinating with codes and ordinances defined outside of Part 11 of Title 24. This section reinforces the state's Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, also known as MWELO. MWELO requires a calculation of allowed water use based on things like your climate zone and landscape area, and compares that to the estimated water use for the proposed landscape plan. For projects with less than 2,500 square feet of landscaping, there's an option to use MWELO's prescriptive compliance pathway instead. Please note the Chula Vista icon in the upper right-hand corner. That's because Chula Vista has a landscape water conservation ordinance as well, which reinforces the city's water conservation goals. And this ordinance parallels MWELO, so we are perfectly aligned between CalGreen and Chula Vista with the state's Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. So the water reuse systems section gets into on-site water reuse systems more fully in the voluntary measures, as indicated by the tiered triangle icon. This measure, however, says that if the local municipality is supplying tertiary recycled water, then you may be required to install recycled water supply systems, such as dual plumbing. As you can see from the icon, Chula Vista has a related ordinance requiring stub outs for residential laundry to landscape systems, which is based on one of CalGreen's residential voluntary measures. So now we'll talk about material conservation and resource efficiency. Just last month, Australia's National Science Agency said that 9.25 million to 15.87 million tons of microplastic are embedded in the seafloor. The amount of fragments embedded in the seafloor is far more than the plastic floating on the ocean surface, which is already scary. We can picture the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which has 87,000 tons of trash alone. Scientists believe that 4.4 million to 8.8 million tons of plastic enter the sea every year. That number is expected to triple to 29 million tons per year by 2040 without drastic changes. The Chula Vista Nature Center highlights this issue with the Washed Ashore project, gathering trash that lands on our beaches. All of this tells me that we must reduce or eliminate our use of plastic. And if that's not possible, then we need to recycle everything else. CalGreen starts to address this in this section. To conserve resources in green building, we can 1, make buildings more durable, reducing the time until it's demolished, and 2, reduce waste throughout the construction process. Moisture can damage a building's longevity by causing issues like mold, rot, and pest infiltration. We address this by looking at how water can infiltrate a building through entries or irrigation on the building, and prevent it through protections like awnings and flashing. Due to construction and demolition waste taking up 22% of our waste stream, CalGreen is making construction teams plan out how waste will be separated on site and recycled or salvaged, or taken to a facility that will process and divert reusable or recyclable materials. We must divert 65% of the construction and demolition waste away from the landfill. Additionally, there are voluntary measures aligned with this mandatory measure. Tier 1 has 75% diversion rate, or 100% of the waste is diverted to meet Tier 2. So CalGreen requires the submittal of a construction waste management plan, showing how you intend to handle reusable and recyclable materials and the estimated amounts. Chula Vista has a waste management template on their website, and CalGreen has one as part of Chapter 8. Additional documentation requirements include holler tags that show diversion rates and amounts of each waste stream if the site separation is a method selected to meet the overall diversion rate requirement. Universal waste, such as batteries, electronics, aerosol cans, fluorescents, and CRTs. If you remember what those are, it's those big TVs that were like 3 feet deep and it's clunky and too heavy to even carry. TVs and monitors of that era, cathode ray tubes, must all be disposed of properly since they're a hazard if sent to the landfill. Additionally, you cannot send tree stumps, rocks, soils, or vegetation from land clearing to the landfill. They must be reused or recycled. To combat our overwhelming plastic and trash issues, we must encourage recycling wherever we can. To do that, CalGreen requires that every project must include areas to collect and store recyclable materials, and they must be readily accessible to the building occupants. As California's building code gets more advanced, especially as the energy code requires our buildings to be higher performing, we end up relying on the proper functioning of our building systems, such as HVAC, irrigation, appliances, and utilities. So for buildings over 10,000 square feet, CalGreen requires commissioning. This process is shown to result in a 5 to 10% energy savings in your building. It starts during the design phase and includes an owner's project requirements document, a basis of design document, commissioning measures shown in construction documents, functional performance testing, documentation and training, including a systems manual, to ensure the operations team knows how the systems are meant to work. The operations team is the key factor in ensuring a building is maintained and continues to operate as it was designed. And finally, a commissioning report is required. In the Energy Code, no matter the size of the project, you must go through a commissioning design review to ensure the owner's project requirements and basis of design are reflected in the design shown on the construction documents. So my key takeaway here is get your commissioning agent on board before the design phase, during the design phase. For buildings less than 10,000 square feet, CalGreen requires testing and adjusting to again ensure our high efficiency systems are performing as intended. This also must include renewable energy, irrigation, and water reuse systems. Proper operation saves money by ensuring equipment is running efficiently and enhances the equipment lifetime. So we're moving on to the last section, environmental quality. This is important because we spend 90% of our time indoors, where the concentration of some pollutants are often 2 to 5 times higher than typical outdoor concentrations. And that's not even during wildfires or naval vessel fires. This statistic is horrifying. However, there are some things that we can do. Due to the dangerous gases and air pollution from fireplaces, CalGreen requires any installed gas fireplace must be direct vent sealed combustion type. This effectively prevents indoor air from being involved in combustion or exhaust of the fireplace. To prevent dust and debris getting into permanent HVAC systems used during construction, a minimum MERV 8 filter must be installed. And before occupancy, it must be replaced, this time with a MERV 13 filter, as you'll see in the later section and as required in the Energy Code. During construction, debris and dust is often blown around and can get into HVAC equipment. To prevent that and the eventual discharge of that dust and debris into the operating building, all duct openings must be sealed until final startup when the systems are ready for operation. Paints, sealants, caulks, and adhesives can off-gas volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, for months after application. CalGreen places limits on the VOC content for these materials, depending on their type and how they're used. Most paints can be easily found with no VOCs these days, so there's no reason to poison your building or your client's building with these chemicals. Another easily available material is carpet with low, no or low or no VOC off-gassing. There are third-party nonprofits that have created testing standards with VOC limits that help us identify these carpets. They've been defining these standards for decades, and there are a lot of people for whom this is a priority. So when California wanted to include limits for this, they didn't have to create a standard. CalGreen recognizes and accepts compliance by selecting carpets that meet the requirements for CHIPS, High Performance Product Database, CRI's Green Label Plus program, or 3 other standards. CalGreen compliance also requires the use of low VOC carpet adhesives, carpet pads, and cushions. For composite wood products such as hardwood plywood, particle board, and MDF, CalGreen has requirements for formaldehyde emissions, as you can see in this table. We do this because high concentrations of formaldehyde can cause cancer and has adverse health effects in lower concentration. CalGreen aligns exactly with the California Air Resources Board, also called CARB's, Phase 2 requirements. And interestingly enough, the federal standards restricting formaldehyde in these same materials have come into effect last year that are exactly the same as CARB and CalGreen. We've set the standard for the country. Sorry. Again, documentation is required to show compliance through spec sheets, chain of custody indicated on an invoice, or labeling. Technically, you'd think that this shouldn't be hard to find since non-compliant composite wood is generally not legal anywhere in the US, but tracking down documentation is still required. The voluntary Tier 1 measure is for products with no added formaldehyde. Similar to carpet, there are a number of recognized industry standards for resilient flooring. Resilient flooring is made from linoleum or vinyl or rubber or cork. Again, California didn't need to look any further than the existing marketplace, which makes finding appropriate flooring easy. Accepted standards include UL Green Guard, RFCI's Floor Score, and 2 more. One of the benefits of certified resilient flooring is the reduction of formaldehyde off-gassing. This measure requires at least 80% of resilient flooring meets one of the standards. However, as you can see, there are options for more stringent compliance in the voluntary measures. 90% for Tier 1 and 100% of resilient flooring is certified under Tier 2. So this whole section, section 5.5, is about minimizing the pollutants that get into the building through the materials we use or our activities. The following 2 measures seek to minimize pollutants getting into the building through outside air. We require MERV 13 filters are installed before occupancy of a building for all HVAC system outside air and return air intakes. And if outdoor smoking is allowed, smoking is prohibited less than 25 feet from building openings, such as entrances, windows, and air intakes. As mentioned in the previous section, indoor moisture can cause mold and rot, which can cause respiratory illnesses. We also know that other harmful chemicals and pollutants can cause health issues as well. Research shows that building-related health issues are associated with building characteristics including dampness, cleanliness, and ventilation. This measure reinforces the ventilation requirements and the exterior wall construction requirements in the California Building Code, which again highlights the crossover of CalGreen with other parts of Title 24 in our effort to protect the health and safety of building occupants. Again, we reinforce other code requirements here, where we're pointing to the Energy Code's requirements for ventilation and CO2 sensors and ventilation controls when demand control ventilation equipment is installed. You can learn more about indoor air quality and ventilation at our upcoming webinar on December 8th, as Lynn mentioned. Just go to the CLEAN website to register. Noise within buildings from either traffic noise outside or mechanical equipment or other loud noises in adjacent spaces disturbs concentration on work or study and provides less than ideal working and learning environments. Providing a comfortable environment for employees contributes significantly to their optimum performance and reduced absenteeism. CalGreen sets sound transmission values for certain building assemblies and components to help with this effort. Moving on to outdoor air quality. Ozone depletion is caused by chlorofluorocarbons and halons. This measure reduces the amount of these gases in the atmosphere by effectively banning them from new HVAC and other refrigeration systems. They have been widely outlawed, so typically new systems are already designed to operate with a new generation of refrigerants. However, there's a voluntary measure that doesn't allow the use of hydrofluorocarbons either. More importantly, to prevent ozone depletion is this measure, requiring a number of steps to reduce refrigerant leaks in retail refrigeration equipment. Requirements include compliant piping and installation that allows for leak detection and repair. Components included in the requirements include valves, tethers, piping, and evacuation. It's pretty detailed, but specific to supermarket refrigerant leaks. So that brings us to Chapter 8. Doug?
Great, thanks, Colleen. So Chapter 8 is a bit more kind of administrative. It's non-technical content. It really is about how we implement CalGreen compliance as architects and engineers, and as building enforcement and inspection. So Chapter 8 basically goes through compliance forms, worksheets, and reference material. Next slide indicates really commonly used approach to those forms. So the American Institute of Architects, the AIA California, has a set of drawing files, DWG, PDF, and other kind of just raw drawing files that can be put into an architect's set of plans, and it shows basically a checklist for compliance for the mandatory CalGreen non-residential measures. And this can be formatted in kind of any kind of type of drawing set you have, or project manual or specifications you might have. But typically these show up on the drawings, and it basically just goes through all of the content we've just talked through. It provides a place for the project teams to cite where the inclusion of that information will be in their plans, and it basically just shows compliance. This is a pretty standard practice, and these get created for each code cycle, the current version since January 2020. These complement, if we go to the next slide, these complement the sort of Chula Vista version of kind of the intake form on the staff side. So there are the GRN forms, Form 5, which is a 2-page form for non-residential projects. And it basically also just goes through kind of the content we've just looked at for the mandatory measures, looking at the reference sheet, and then it provides space for the reviewer comments. This is, I think most project teams in Chula Vista are familiar with this and are used to kind of seeing this and working through the GRN sheets as a means of back and forth for permitting and inspection as we kind of go through projects. But just highlighting that. The next slide highlights a different document that the inspection team often uses. And it basically has a list of documents for final inspection. We've highlighted a few here. There are a number of things that are a part of kind of what's needed when a project team is going through final inspections, which is what's highlighted at the bottom and kind of called out on the image to your right there. Is the two that kind of relate back are there's energy code compliance and green building field inspections that are part of that, and it depends a little bit on the use type about what those inspections will entail. And then similarly, the last item there is the code documentation for, and here's another example of where we talk about Title 24 and we're referring to it only as energy. So Title 24, Part 6, Energy Code, the documentation, it includes the MEC, which is the Mechanical Equipment Compliance, and the LTG forms, which is the lighting compliance. And we didn't include the HERS rating in there. That would be applicable to residential use projects. So the way our code is split is small scale residential projects under 3 stories are a part of the residential code, which we covered last time. And any kind of multifamily 3 stories or higher is going to be in the non-residential code. And so they would actually have a HERS rating for that. Now, one of the code changes that's coming as it relates to the energy code is the development of a separate energy code for multifamily buildings, which will be a part of that, we think, the 2022 cycle. So that's something to look forward to as the kind of new code is being action voted on right now, actually. So the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the voluntary measures. So Colleen mentioned as we were going through that there is this performance standard embedded into the code. And this is where CalGreen starts to look even more like LEED and other green building rating systems. But there are tiers that a team could voluntarily choose to develop to. And these include a mix of additional mandatory measures and a number of basically additional practices or measures to get to a total number to achieve like a higher level of performance than what is otherwise state mandatory or state required. Now, this is another example of communities and how they've approached REACH codes by just adopting a tier 1 requirement for all or certain building types in the non-res code. So for example, the REACH codes that I mentioned earlier on electric vehicles, you can choose to adopt all of the tier 1 requirements and basically require like a 15-point increase over your baseline, which is what's probably hard to read, but highlighted in the middle column, tier 1 at the bottom where it says approximate total measures is 15. And then similarly for tier 2, which is a higher level of performance, that would be 25 additional measures. And if you're curious about how this relates to LEED, which often does come up by projects and project teams, basically CalGreen meets all of the prerequisites of the LEED Green Building Rating System, and it provides a minimum of 6 points. But honestly, it's when you look at the level of performance between CalGreen and the LEED Building Design and Construction Standard, it's good for actually about 50 points. So which means that it's equivalent to a silver level certification, roughly. So when project teams in California are trying to decide whether or not to do LEED, when they've set the bar, it starts to look more like a tier 1 kind of approach, when that would be roughly equivalent to LEED Gold, and then tier 2, which is it's closer to a LEED Platinum type performance. So if you're kind of wondering what those functional differences are between the voluntary measures of tier 1 and tier 2 relative to the baseline code, and then how it compares to other industry practices, that's the kind of a simple rule of thumb approach. If we go to the next slide, another just kind of highlighting that electric vehicle conversation a little bit more. There is some changes that happen in quantity or increase in kind of equipment infrastructure. So we talked previously about the electric vehicle spaces. The baseline number, once you get above 10 spaces, is that you have 6% of your spaces need to be electric vehicle capable, and the tier 1 would actually raise that to 10%. And so kind of highlighting in the screen capture there of the Division 5.1 gives you an idea of how you would lay out both the mandatory and the tier 1 prerequisites if you were going to be pursuing a tier 1 approach, so those voluntary measures. So the next slide also has a little bit more, slightly different example of that same kind of thinking around energy, looking at tier 1 prerequisites, where you are going to focus, so these are highlighted in green. So the mandatory, every project you need to comply is in black in the chart. The tier 1 prerequisites are in green, and then the tier 1 electives would be your choice. You get to choose one of those. So kind of give you a sense about how this would work together. But again, you would meet the standard energy standard, and then you would also, from an energy efficiency standpoint, you have to basically save, depending on your use type, 5 or 10% of calculated value of energy. And again, that's using the time-dependent valuation metric. And then where you have 8,000 square feet or greater, you have to, for restaurants anyway, there's a service water heating need that's a part of that. So different use types have different prerequisites under the tiered system and also under the CalGreen approach throughout. And then you have other electives that are part of that. So it still does have kind of that menu approach that like LEED has made common practice in industry. We've got just a couple more slides talking a little bit about Chula Vista and the ordinance history. So last time we looked at this slide and we talked about the evolution of CalGreen. And through some of the questions that have been asked and we've responded to in the Q&A, we've highlighted a couple of places where Chula Vista has had leadership well above the state codes through its long history of kind of resource conservation. So starting in 1980, moving into very early climate action plans in the 90s, and then some specific, energy-related performance pieces on photovoltaic pre-wiring, and having its own energy reach code through 2008 and 2013 cycles. And then, the shade tree policy, which we talked a little about today, was ahead of the curve for the state, even after CalGreen had been established. Chula Vista was out front on that, and now the state has caught up. And then there are some other aspects of how energy efficiency is integrated into in the consideration of emissions and planning, which I would say is still somewhat ahead of the state in many ways. And then in our last session, when we talked about residential codes, we highlighted the residential gray water stub out. So, just a note about kind of where we are on this. So lots of early leadership from Chula Vista. We'll highlight that on the next slide. And currently what we're seeing is the state of California has really kind of aggressively moved more and more towards environmental sustainability and the use of emissions in particular on as a metric rather than energy, for example, but emissions broadly. And that's why you see things like the electric vehicle code, the building energy codes. The emissions is a major issue from a policy and a regulatory standpoint for the state of California. So highlighting some of the past history in 2012, there was a Beacon Award that was earned by Chula Vista, and noted that it distinguished itself as a local government leader by integrating energy efficiency, green building, and other sustainable planning principles into every aspect of development. So it's worth noting that for those of you that work at the city that are on this call, which I think is many folks, there's a lot of really great leadership history and legacy here that you're operating within, and that's no small feat. In many ways, Chula Vista has driven the direction that the state has gone and followed, and has now caught up a little bit. But Chula Vista definitely was one of the shining stars in advancing building codes around green building and energy over the last really 20, 30 years. So I think with that, we'll move to questions if there are any additional ones. Got about 10 minutes left. Thank you. This will be, I think, my last presentation as part of this series. So special thanks to staff, Yasmin for helping coordinate us, Barbara and Lynn Mitchke as well, and Colleen for putting all this together. So
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Colleen and Doug. That was a lot of information. So does anyone have any more questions they want to chat in, or I don't know if you can be unmuted even, if you want to ask a question. Maybe not. Corey, do you have anything to say? Oh,
yeah. Got one in there now.
There's one.
Yeah, the question is, have any local jurisdictions adopted CalGreen Tier 1 or 2? I am familiar with a few. Corey, I'd have to pull that off of the state does have a database of that. I'm happy to send that out separately. But yeah, there are a number of communities. I can't think of any in San Diego.
Yeah, I think Carlsbad picked up Tier 1 for non-residential.
You may be right about that, Lynn. Yeah, did they do the full piece of it or just parts? Yeah. So that's what I want to clarify. Yeah, and then I know a number of jurisdictions in Northern California definitely have. So we can get that list to you, Corey. No problem.
I wonder if Corey wants to tell us about any other ordinances that might be coming up.
Yeah.
Since we have a few minutes here.
For that, I will need to change Corey's role. Hold on, give me a second, please.
Corey, would you like to tell us about anything?
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. It was really great. as you can tell from my questions, I'm really interested in specifically some of the electric vehicle language from the climate change working group. There is a recommendation around decarbonizing the transportation sector. And so, like I said in my question, there has been some pushback when we've looked at doing it specifically at the multifamily sector. And, people question whether Chula Vista is the market that's going to be utilizing the electric vehicle chargers. And so, I think we still have some of those kind of like demand questions. But overall, I think I guess it'll be also interesting to see how COVID affects some of the workplace commuting, because as we're talking about, requiring that workplace commuting, I could see that being a pushback there too. But I think that the standards are really interesting, and I think there's definitely some interest from the community in kind of promoting electric vehicles. We just have to find that balance. But the other thing I will mention is also from Climate Change Working Group. Two of the recommendations that I think could be kind of taken in consolidation with this is looking at decarbonizing building standards. So that's, something that is new for us. And so, not only about, I guess, and it aligns a lot with the state's, look at emissions. So it's not just what is the energy that the building is using, but what actual emissions are is that energy caused from.
Yeah.
And so, we'll be looking at probably starting with more of the residential, where there's been a little bit more action on decarbonization. But I definitely think that could tie in some industrial uses. And, I was joking with Barbara earlier, I would love to see some like industrial or commercial decarbonization pilots, because I think that there is some language about, like, for example, the one I go to, or the one I've heard is walks. There's no all electric walk. And I've a big fan of Asian and wok food. So I said, there's no way I'm going to get rid of those from my community. But that being said, there's a lot of really smart, talented companies and inventors and people out there. And so, I'd love to see if there's a way to, well, not on a large scale, but just a more focused way to kind of pilot and showcase how, we can keep a lot of the services and the quality of the products that we like, while just removing the emissions. And the last Climate Change Working Group recommendation I'll mention is the a goal for carbon neutrality by 2045. So again, a shift to looking at the actual emissions and seeing how we can, really drive those down to a low amount that we can offset with carbon sequestration.
Yeah. I'm happy. That sounds like a series of follow-up conversations, probably, Corey. But that's really aligned to certainly the science, which tells us that we should have zero emissions by 2050. And a lot of communities are taking the recommendations of the IPCC very aggressively now to kind of do their part to meet the 1.5 degree warming. As much to mitigate the impacts of warming as much as we can. So emissions being really the metric that matters. Relative to that, a lot of communities are now looking at, and where we'll see, I think, the future of state codes moving to when emissions happen and when energy is consumed. And that'll be driving a lot of our energy storage policies at the state level, as well as just how we price and value energy and emissions. So that's not quite in the 2022 code, but it's getting closer, but it's kind of a little bit of a rift on that time-dependent valuation. And then on the decarbonization pieces, there are actually some solutions for rounded bottom pans that are possible with induction. They're not super great just yet, but you're right that is advancing rapidly. And there are some resources that will be coming online around tool lending, which will include induction cooktops and various other decarbonization, electrification type measures. We hope here regionally soon. So keep an eye out for that as well. But yeah, there's a lot of work that's happening statewide on all of these topics. There'll be some large investments rolling out in the form of different programs starting really as soon as January and throughout 2021, which I think will be very helpful to address a lot of the questions you're asking. But you opened with the electric vehicle and understanding your market need for multifamily housing. And there's plenty of language on what those codes can look like. Sample code, reach code language that's available. And the interesting thing is, if you're looking at a CalGreen based reach code, it doesn't require the same level of cost benefit analysis that an energy code reach code does. And there's lots of details behind that, which I won't go into, but the understanding your market, one of the biggest factors for whether or not consumers choose electric vehicles is whether or not they have access to charging. Now, in a multifamily home, there's a lot of questions that go with that about the metering, the bills, the circuiting, and the revenue model associated with that charging. But generally speaking, there are enough incentives to make the cost of ownership of electric vehicles on par with or less expensive than fossil fuel burning internal combustion engines, depending on your use pattern and commute, which of course 2020 is not a typical year. Let's hope anyway, it's not the typical. Yeah. Great, but yeah, happy to kind of work with any kinds of follow-up questions there that you feel like need some additional support.
I did have time to go and look at the Carlsbad ordinance, and it is for Tier 1, and it's required for all new non-residential projects and major renovations to non-residential properties, adding 1,000 square feet or with a permit valued at $200,000 or more.
Great. Thank you, Lynn.
So see, Gino asked a question about whether Chula Vista requires commissioning for the plans. And yes, Chula Vista does require the commissioning documents to be submitted with the plans. So do we have any other questions? One more minute. Gino asked Title 24 documents or commission report. Commissioning, applicable commissioning reports are required, and Title 24 Energy, Part 6 Energy Code does require that all new commercial projects at least submit the design phase of that. Over 10,000 square feet, there are other requirements. So I guess that takes us to the end, and thank you all very much for attending. I put my email there in the chat for any ICC CEUs for today. And thank you very much, Colleen and Doug. That was really interesting and informative presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, especially for our awesome presenters for joining us.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye now.